We three kings of Israel. Saul, David, and Solomon. Saul has passed away. David finally has the kingdom all under, that is, Israel and Judah, everything under him. Ishbosheth is gone, and he's having successes in these wars and these battles that he's fighting, right? We found out at the end of 2 Samuel chapter 10 and verse 19, when all the kings who were servants of Hadadezer saw they had been defeated by Israel. They made peace with Israel and became subject to him. So the Syrians were afraid to save the Ammonites anymore, and they probably should have learned their lesson even before that. But at any rate, we move on. 2 Samuel chapter 11. This is the chapter that most of us know about regarding David, right? David and Bathsheba. So we start in verse 1 of 2 Samuel chapter 11. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. Interesting. David didn't go. That was the time when kings go out to battle, and David didn't go. He remained at Jerusalem, and it happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house. So he's kind of lazing around while his people are in battle. That's interesting. He saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, I am pregnant. Now, there are some arguments, and I understand the arguments, but there are some arguments that Bathsheba was a pawn, and of course this is the king of Israel. She's subject to him, and he's coming out and more or less abusing her by doing the thing that he did. I can see where that's coming from in some cases. There's also the argument that people make that she was bathing on her rooftop. I can't say whether that was a normal thing or not. That may have been a common occurrence there, and that's just where you did your bath. And David happened to be walking out at the same time, but I would think she kind of had to know that if David's walking around, that he could probably see her from that point. However, the text doesn't say one way or the other whether or not she had a choice in the matter. But we do know she did have a choice in the matter, and the reason why we know she had a choice is because we can look at the example of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Remember, Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, which kind of set the stage for all kinds of issues between, Israel and the other tribes. However, Joseph was sold into slave by his brothers, and he ended up working for Potiphar, right? So he was in Potiphar's household. He did very well and rose up through the ranks, so he became very close to Potiphar's household and working in the house itself. In this case, Bathsheba was right there, close to David's house, obviously. Potiphar's wife had direct control over him, right? She was his master as well as Potiphar was, and Potiphar's wife said, you come, you lay with me now. And Joseph said, nah, I'm not going to do that. And he ran away. There was a choice there. He also had consequence, and he was put in jail. And we know these things. Now, God worked through all that. So it's not like there isn't consequence when we make the right choice, but we can still make the right choice, and therefore we are still held responsible. There's nothing in the text that said she fought it in any way whatsoever. But honestly, this isn't really about her. This is about David, and this is about what David did and what David did wrong. Not just what he did, but what he did wrong. And what he did wrong was, instead of saying, oh, hey, there's a beautiful woman bathing on the rooftop, I'm going to keep walking, I'm going to go the other way. No, he pursued it. He inquired about her. This is Uriah the Hittite, right? Uriah the Hittite's wife. And so he said, well, she's already married to somebody. I'll leave that alone. No, he said, Uriah's out of battle. Come on, let's go. Okay. So instead of moving away, they came together. And again, when you have multiple children by multiple women, issues ensue. Now, this is a specific instance. Obviously, you have adultery and you have David getting her pregnant. And then what he decides to do after that goes even farther. Verse 6, so David sent to Joab, word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite, and Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab was doing and how the people were doing and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. And Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. When they told David, Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, have you not come from a long journey? Why did you not go down to your house? Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah dwell in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing. Then David said to Uriah, remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next, and David invited him, and he ate and drank in his presence, so that he made him drunk. Okay, and in the evening when he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his lord, but he did not go down to his house. It is possible to be drunk and still make good decisions. Just saying. We're going to move on from there. Verse 14, in the morning David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, that he may be struck down and die. He's literally carrying his own death papers, his death warrant, more or less. Oh my goodness. And as Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant men. And the men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite also died. So what David wanted, in the end, was accomplished, at least in this case. All right. Then Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting, and he instructed the messenger, when you have finished telling all the news about the fighting to the king, then if the king's anger arises, and if he says to you, why did you go so near the city to fight? Do you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, the son of Jerubbesheth? Did not a woman cast an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died at Thebez? In other words, you were way too close. What were you doing there? Why did you go so near the wall? Then you shall say, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. So the messenger went and came and told David all that Joab had sent him to tell. The messenger said to David, the men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. Then the archers shot at your servants from the wall. Some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. David said to the messenger, thus you shall say to Joab, do not let this matter displease you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Strengthen your attack against the city and overthrow it, and encourage him. Wow, so kind and thoughtful of David, isn't it? When the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she lamented over her husband. And when the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Yeah, I'd say so. He took a man's wife, and then while he was away at battle, fighting the battle for him that he should have been at anyway, right? And then he gets her pregnant. It's possible that they were only together one time, but it's also possible that they could have had a little thing going on, and it happened over and over again. And then he gets her pregnant, and now he has to deal with it, right? So he tries to get her husband, to come back and, be with your wife, have a good time, right? And the husband's more righteous than David in this area right now and saying, no, I can't do that. My men aren't doing that. The ark of God is dwelling in a temple. I can't go down and be at my house while we're fighting battles. And anyway, he doesn't do it. David says, I've got to deal with this somehow. And he sends Uriah to the front of the battlefield and has him killed. If you were to look at this incident on its own and isolate it, you probably would say, holy crow, he's just walking along and he sees this beautiful woman and says, oh my goodness, I should have her. And wow, that escalated quickly, didn't it? Maybe kind of, sort of. But we see how many wives he had. We see he had wives and concubines, and there was already something that he had not gotten under control in his life. Let's go to James chapter 1 really quickly for a little bit of a cross-reference here. We go to let's start in verse 13. James chapter 1, 13. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. And we see that here in this short passage, in this short just time, more or less a short time between when Uriah went out to battle and then when David did the things that he did. He has a temptation. Now, he may never have thought he was tempted by God, but that is beside the point. He has a temptation, and he lets that lead it into desire, okay? And then desire, he allows that to be conceived in him. Go find out about this woman, right? Finds out about the woman. Okay. So the temptation, he sees her. Desire, go find out about this woman. Desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. The sin, he brings her back, right? And they do the thing, and then he has a situation on his hands. And in this case, it truly brought about a physical death, not just a death. There is a death in our fellowship and our communion with God when we sin, especially when we knowingly sin and don't address it or say it's fine and say it's good. Then there's a breakdown and there's a separation there. That word death means separation. So there's a separation between us and God in our communion, in our fellowship. It doesn't mean that we're not saved. It just means we have a sin that we need to deal with. And this is what we're going to find out as well in chapter 12, that David has a sin that he needs to deal with. So we look at 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 1, and we see the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said, there were two men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought, and he brought it up, and it grew up with him and his children, and used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the guest who had come to him, but he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die, and he will restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity. Nathan said to David, you are that man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you out of the hand of Saul, and I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms, and gave you the house of Israel and Judah, and if this were too little, I would add to you as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord, to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore the sword will never depart from your house, because you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he will lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. You did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord also has put away your sin. You will not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child who is born to you will die. Then Nathan went to his house. There's a few things in here that strike me as quite odd or out of the ordinary of what I might expect. One is, the Lord tells him, I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms and gave you the house of Israel and Judah, and if this were too little, I would add to you as much more. That strikes me as quite odd. He had multiple wives, and we know, even at this point, from the beginning, God created them, man and woman, but Adam and Eve, one man, one woman, that's the intended relationship, not multiple wives. And yet, God said, I would have added to you as much more if this were too little for you, right? Quite interesting there. But he took the wife of Uriah, he took someone else's wife, and killed the man for it. But the other thing that strikes me is where David says to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan says to David, the Lord also has put away your sin, you will not die. It reminds me of 1 John, where it says, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. That confession is what David did here. That confession, to confess means to agree. It's agreeing with the Lord, calling sin, sin. And when it was presented to him, because remember, there was another king in Israel before David, and that king had a sin presented to him. What did he do when sin was presented to him? He tried to slough it off. He tried to make excuses for it, shove it away from him, off to the people. The people, they're the ones who took of the best of the Amalekites and didn't destroy everyone. He made an excuse for, well, Samuel, you weren't here, so I had to, make a sacrifice and inquire of the Lord. David doesn't do that here. David doesn't make an excuse. David says, I have sinned against the Lord. And the Lord forgives him. However, that forgiveness doesn't mean the absence of all consequences of our sin. And this is what we see here. By this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child who is born to you will die. Then Nathan went to his house. Verse 15 of 2 Samuel chapter 12. And the Lord afflicted the child that Uriah's wife bore to David, and he became sick. David therefore sought God on behalf of the child, and David fasted and went in and lay all night on the ground. And the elders of the house stood beside him to raise him from the ground, but he would not, nor did he eat food with them. On the seventh day the child died. And the servants of David were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they said, behold, while the child was yet alive, we spoke to him, and he did not listen to us. How then can we say to him, the child is dead? He may do himself harm. They were afraid of David harming himself, and maybe even them, were they to tell him that the child was dead. However, when David saw that his servants were whispering together, David understood that the child was dead. And David said to his servants, is the child dead? They said, he is dead. Then David arose from the earth, verse 20, and washed and anointed himself and changed his clothes, and he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. He then went to his own house, and when he asked, they set food before him, and he ate. Then his servant said to him, what is this thing that you have done? You fasted and wept for the child while he was alive, but when the child died, you arose and ate food. That's kind of opposite of the way that things were done at that time, right? He said, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who knows whether the Lord will be gracious to me, that the child may live. But now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. I have heard the argument, some think it's evil, that God would punish the child in this way, right? You're punishing the child for the father's sin. And I would posit that if this life is all there is, then to be born in this way, immediately be sick, and that be the entirety of your life, to be sick and then to die, yeah, that would be a great evil indeed. But if there is more, and if God is real and exists, if he wants us to be with him, if there is a place to go after we die, and if what David said in verse 23 is true, I will go to him, but he will not return to me, then it is not a great evil. Actually, I think the child has been spared from much great evil, and we'll see that, in fact, and would be with the Lord at this point. So it could seem to be a great evil, but if we're not looking at it from the point of view that God has, then we're going to see a lot of things in a skewed perspective. We have the skewed perspective. God has the ultimate reality, and he sees the ultimate reality. So let's always remember that and keep things in mind as far as the way that he views them. So we see the child has died, and in verse 24 of 2 Samuel 12, then David comforted his wife Bathsheba, and went into her and lay with her, and she bore a son, and he called his name Solomon. It means peace. And the Lord loved him, and sent a message by Nathan the prophet, so he called his name Jedediah, because of the Lord. And then we see, to wrap up the end of 2 Samuel here, I want to end at the end of this because it kind of puts a bow on the fighting and things that had happened. Verse 26, now Joab fought against Rabbah of the Ammonites and took the royal city. And Joab sent messengers to David and said, I have fought against Rabbah. Moreover, I have taken the city of waters. Now then, gather the rest of the people together and encamp against the city and take it, lest I take the city and it be called by my name. Wake up, David. Come on, let's go. So David gathered all the people together and went to Rabbah and fought against it and took it. And he took the crown of their king from his head. The weight of it was a talent of gold, and in it was a precious stone, and it was placed on David's head. And he brought out the spoil of the city, a very great amount. And he brought out the people who were in it, and set them to labor with saws and iron picks and iron axes, and made them toil at the brick kilns. And thus he did to all the cities of the Ammonites. Then David and all the people returned to Jerusalem. A great victory, indeed, following a great tragedy. Great tragedy for David. However, Solomon is born, and we know a little bit already about what God did in Solomon's life. And there are some really interesting things that come from him and some amazing things that come from him. Before we get there, though, there are some other consequences of David's, whether you want to call it promiscuity, but for certain there are consequences of the different children that he had by all these different women and the dysfunctional family life that he ended up with. And we see some very real physical consequences for all the covenant and all the promises that God had given David. There were still some very real problems that he had in his life here on earth. To me, that's a comfort to me. It kind of helps me to say, you know what? It doesn't matter what's going on in my life, because God can still use me and use my life and do great things, and I can be a part of it, and that is a wonderful thing. But I do need to have that same heart and that same attitude. Not the heart of Saul, small in my own eyes, but the heart of David that says, you know what? God is with me. I'm going to do trusting him. I'm going to do whatever it is my hand finds to do, trusting that God is with me and he will work in it and work through it. And that's a wonderful thing.